All right, hey, welcome to Gathering One. We are going to go through on this video and explore the internal model of the Book of Mormon, right? So this should be kind of my most exhaustive Book of Mormon internal model video. So it's going to be kind of a long one. I hope you can follow along. If you want something a little more entertaining, then I hope you'll check out one of the more other videos when I'm kind of talking with groups, especially my Zion Media videos, right? So we do a lot of our more entertaining stuff on there where I'm kind of just doing more of an overview. On this one, I'll give an overview, but then we will go deep diving, right? Perhaps as exhaustive as anything you've ever seen on the internal model of the Book of Mormon. And anyway, as we go through every single scripture, I'm going to try and apply those internal models to some of the external models, right? So if this is your first time seeing one of my videos, I really would encourage you to see my overview video, right? Go to the channel homepage and check out my overview video so you can see what I'm all about. And then check out some of my other videos as well. Definitely check out my website, gatheredin.one, all right? And we'll be using that as we go through a lot of these things. But anyway, I hope this is educational for you. Let's maybe just kind of dive right in. Right, so the Book of Mormon, for those who don't know, I'm just going to assume that people at least know what the Book of Mormon is. This ancient text that's kind of one of the main scriptures of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, along with the Old and New Testaments, right, the Bible. This idea that the New World, right, that America was inhabited by ancient people, right, that Egyptians and Israelite groups came to the New World and founded kind of societies here. And those societies prospered, but ended up being integrated into the natives or destroyed, right? The parts that had a cohesive Near Eastern culture were destroyed. The parts that integrated were kind of like lost in the gene pool and cultural mix of the Native Americans. So anyway, yeah, you can check that out on other videos. And here we're just going to dive in and talk about the geography that the book says internally. And we're going to try to apply that to actual locations in the church in general right now, right? There's kind of like there's the two main groups that most of the members of the church kind of adhere to one or the other, you could say, as far as where the Book of Mormon happened. Those two main ones are like the Mesoamerican model, people who think that happened in Mesoamerica, predominantly like Guatemala and southernmost Mexico. And then the second group are the Heartlanders that think that it all happened, for the most part, it all happened in the eastern United States. And then there's some minor factions of groups that think that it happened in South America. And then there's some really small groups that maybe think it happened in Baja California or even, Malaysia. Anyway, we won't really give those ones much time here. Let's just jump into the main groups, right? The Heartlanders, Mesoamerican model, and my model. Check out some of my other videos for a real overview of my model, because it's got pretty awesome stuff, right? So my model is kind of the unified continental model. Believes it happened in both Mesoamerica and North America, that it covered the entire continent, right? The premise of my model really is that this is a general overview of like this historian, Mormon and Moroni, that they knew what they were talking about, that there was a far more cohesive continental culture than even modern archaeologists or historians give credit for. That just like when the Spanish came and conquered the Aztec Empire, they definitely knew about the seven cities of Savoia, the Southwest cultures, definitely the West Mexico cultures, but they understood. They were trading down into South America, they were trading up the West Coast into the Southwest, and they were even trading up the Mississippi. And so they understood kind of a continental picture of the world. My premise is that Mormon and Moroni did even more than the Aztecs. They really understood the entire continent, and that the Book of Mormon is basically telling about the culture of the entire continent. Every single group that's talked about in the Book of Mormon is represented in a major culture in North America. And even though the majority of it, really kind of the heartland, happened right there in Mesoamerica, where the main population center was, they're still always touching on the land northward and all that. Okay, so anyway, let's jump into it. And you can learn more as I go on if you're not up to speed already. Okay, so as I'm gonna jump into my article here, Book of Mormon Geography and Internal Model. I gathered in one site, and we're going to kind of go through the overview and just read through some of these scriptures so that I can kind of prove to you some of the main premises and then apply them to these different models. But let's just kind of start right here. We'll start with so the Book of Mormon has one chapter that really gives kind of a basic overview of the geography. right? Chapter 22 of Alma. And this is kind of like a story where he's talking about the kings of the Nephites, the kings of the Lamanites, the Lamanite king, and he's saying where he's sending this proclamation that he makes throughout, and he just kind of gives like a great general overview of the land. All right, so let's just dive right in and go over the basic overview of what the chapter says and try and compare it to these different models. Okay, so if you can see the screen here, my cursor, I'm just going to go down the article. You can follow along on the website, or you can just follow along on the video here. But let's talk about some really important aspects of it, right? Okay, so first, Alma 22:32. I think this is incredibly important. If you'll notice, so like when I go through here are three general internal models that people who have no dog in the fight, they're not really trying to apply it to an actual model. They came up with these internal models. I have my own that I did actually when I was in seminary, also when I was like 16 or so, and it was actually pretty similar to these ones. I didn't use these, but they all come to a pretty similar consensus, right? Because the internal model is fairly consistent, and it's because of these verses we're about to go through, right? That they make it kind of an Isthmian type of character. Like just follow along, and we'll see why they do the things the way they do, because it's fairly clear, right? So let's start in just verse 32, and then we'll backtrack a little bit. But in this first section, this is the land of Nephi, the land of Zarahemla, right? The land of Nephi where the Nephites live. The land of Zarahemla is their capital. Or sorry, the land of Nephi is where the Nephites first live, right? The people of Nephi, then they move to the land of Zarahemla. That becomes the new capital of the Nephites, and then the Lamanites take over the land of Nephites. It says those lands were nearly surrounded by water, there being a small neck of land between the land northward, right, which is called Mulek or desolation, according to Helaman 6 and Alma 22:30, and the land southward, which is called Lehi, or land of Nephi / bountiful, right, in those scriptures. So let's just specify here. It says, so thus the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla were nearly surrounded by water, there being a small neck of land between the land northward and the land southward, right? And I want you to I hope that you'll come in here and actually click on these scriptures, right, and go to them and realize these are absolutely direct quotes, right? So just go through and read the actual scriptures. So, I'm not making up anything up here. I'm doing direct quotes from the text, and they're all referenced so that you can really easily go directly to them, right? So when I talk about the fact that the land south was called Lehi, the land north was called Mulek, after the son of Zedekiah, these are all direct quotes, okay? So follow along if you'd like to. So the second point I want to make here, so they're all surrounded by water. So that's why we get the pictures that we do in some of these internal models. It says the land of Nephi's borders stretch from sea to sea. Okay, the land of Nephi's borders stretched from sea to sea, from the east sea to the west sea. All right, so every model has that in it. Why? Because it says the king sent a proclamation throughout the land amongst all his people who were in all his land, who were in all the regions round about, which land of Nephi, right, was bordering even to the sea on the east and on the west, right? So it's hard to fight against that it's saying that the land of Nephi, right, where he sent his proclamation to, was bordering even to the sea on the east and on the west. So his land borders to the sea on the east, and his land borders to the sea on the west. All right? So that's our first big step. We're going to jump into models here and actually kind of take that. In a geographic model, land of Nephi down here goes from East Sea to the West Sea. All the internal models, East Sea to the West Sea. Here's the land of Nephi, here's the land of Nephi, here's the land of Nephi, all going from the East Sea to the West Sea. But now let's actually compare that to some of these models, like the Heartland Model and the Meso models. So here in the Heartland Model, here's our land of Nephi, right? Most groups that do Heartland modeling agree that the land of Nephi kind of stretches from Tennessee southward. So here's our East Sea, but where is our West Sea? Right, because it says that it stretches from the sea east to the sea west. So we have to do a little bit of fudging here, and we have to assume that somehow the Caribbean was both a South Sea and a West Sea, right? And all models kind of do this fudging, except for mine. Like I say, I think that mine fulfills pretty much every major requirement. But these other ones, we kind of have to be like, well, where is the sea west? And in other verses, they'll try and make the sea west, right, like one of the Great Lakes. So it's like Lake Michigan or something is the sea west because this is their narrow neck, right? And in other ones, this is the narrow neck. So then this is the sea west. Well, it's like, well, you'd have to put the land of Nephi up in there because the land of Nephi has to go from sea east to sea west. How does that work? Let's jump to the Swordson model. Land of Nephi, and the city of Nephi, and most of these models is Caminaljuyu and Guatemala. So here's our sea east and our sea west. We have kind of a little bit of an issue because it's like, well, is this a southern sea? It's not very west. It's almost like a sea south. I mean, that's like, so if the land of Nephi goes from the sea east to sea west, it's almost like a south sea. But in general, it's still a west sea, right? So, I mean, it still works, even though we'll see as we go through all these, the directionality in the meso models is like weird, right? And there's an explanation for that. They use kind of a scripture, not even a scripture, they use some historical information to try and show that Egyptians kind of like shifted their coordinate system by 90 degrees. And so north wasn't actually north, north was east, east was south, south was west. It's kind of a wild supposition, I think, but let's give it to them. All right, it works, maybe, right? So and the sea west definitely works, right? We could say this is all the sea west, so that works. So here's the sea east and sea west. Land of Nephi goes between the two. So in both the Usumacinta and the Greek meso models, sure, right? Land of Nephi goes from sea east to sea west. So in that one, the meso models are stronger than the Heartland ones, right? But the Heartland models have their strengths in other areas. Okay, so let's head back and go to our next one. Okay, the borders of the land Nephi and the land of Zarahemla were separated by a narrow strip of wilderness, which also ran from the sea to sea, from the east sea to the west sea. Okay, so the direct quote, which land of Nephi was divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness, which ran from the sea east even to the sea west. Okay, so all of our models have to have a narrow strip of wilderness separating Zarahemla and Nephi, which runs from sea to sea. So let's compare that. Let's go to the Heartland model. Our narrow strip of wilderness would be here. I think the Appalachians would make a great strip of wilderness. Like those make a great east wilderness. As far as a strip of wilderness separating their land of Zarahemla and Bountiful, I don't really see that there's much different about these kind of regions that would make them like a wilderness as opposed to, Iowa and Indiana and all the areas of their land of Zarahemla or Ohio. But I mean, we could just say maybe it was uninhabited. Maybe it was swampy. We could give it to them. But once again, it has to run from the East Sea to the West Sea. So, I mean, it says specifically, right? East Sea to the West Sea. So then what? Did it run all the way to the Pacific over here? I guess. I don't know. That's a weakness. It works, I guess, but it's a weakness. Okay. As far as the Mesoamerican models, they've actually got a great narrow strip of wilderness, right? So they've got this kind of mountain chain, and maybe I'll have to pull in Google Earth on some of these. So actually, we'll open that up so that we can see some of these things more close up. Well, as we're waiting for that, I'll just show you. There is kind of a narrow strip of wilderness that goes between their land of Nephi and their land of Zarahemla, and it really works as Zarahemla as a wilderness because it really is kind of like a very mountainous terrain. And then also, so not only the Greek Halva, but the Usumacinta, they've kind of got the same one. Although the Rio Passion model, they have their narrow strip of wilderness being here, and they've got the same problem that the Heartlanders do. That it's like, well, I mean, is that narrow strip of wilderness any different? Is there any kind of, I would suggest that the wildernesses are all kind of like they're either mountainous or they're deserty or there's something to do with those that makes them so they're kind of like not very hospitable, the way that it talks about them, so that they end up not being very inhabited, which is why they call them wildernesses. So let me just show you on Google Earth. Let's just hit this up and hopefully it's recording this. And we're just going to go and kind of prove that this area in the meso models really is pretty darn mountainous. Here's their narrow strip of wilderness. Let's turn off boundaries, and I've got all of the sites on here, right? So you've got this big valley. That's definitely not a wilderness. That was highly inhabited. But this mountain chain, right? This mountain chain and this mountain chain, those are definitely kind of like what you would expect of wilderness. I mean, look how rugged that is. And there really just aren't that many towns in here now. Like these mountains are pretty, I mean, they're not impassable, but they're rough. Okay, so I hope you're following along here. Then let's go on to the next one. Let's go to, let's go to my model. Okay, so here's the Continental Model, right? So my narrow strip of wilderness sits right here between the Mexican highland, right? Zarahemla, where the population center always was, Teotihuacan, Cuicuilco, all the major cities. My land of Nephi, right, which is Monte Alban, and Oaxaca. So we've got this kind of narrow strip of wilderness that separates the two of them. And let me just show that on Google Earth so you can really see that it is a narrow strip of wilderness. So here it is. Let's get north so you all have your bearings here. All right, so here we go. in between the Mexican highland and the Zapotec civilization, you've got this entire area. It's an narrow strip of wilderness, but specifically like this area right here. And there's pretty much no cities in here. This really makes it a fantastic narrow strip of wilderness because it's pretty inhospitable. Not only is it so incredibly mountainous, it's the weather is horrible. It's so seasonal. You have the very marked dry part of the year and then a wet part of the year that makes it pretty hard to live there. Right. And so I have, anyway, the Mixtec areas are the narrow strip of wilderness. So that's mine. But let's keep going. You can see they've all got their strengths and weaknesses here. You can kind of judge for yourself which one you think is best. Like I say, I think that mine is actually, even the narrow strip of wilderness, I think mine is best, but the other Mayan models have a great narrow strip of wilderness. Okay, so the land of Zarahemla are separated by a narrow strip of wilderness. Let's move on. The land bountiful, which the Nephites had inhabited, was north of Zarahemla and also stretched even from the east to the west sea. Okay, let's read the actual verse. All right, you're following me? The land bountiful is north of the Nephites, and it stretches from the east to the west sea. So it says specifically, the Nephites had taken possession of all the northern parts of the land, bordering on the north, even until they came to the land which they called Bountiful. And it came to pass that the Nephites had inhabited the land of Bountiful, even from the east unto the west sea. Right? Now, it doesn't say east sea, it says east unto the west sea. We're going to suppose that that means the east sea to the west sea, but we can't specifically know that for sure. But it sure sounds like that's probably what it's saying, from the east sea to the west sea. But we can look at it both ways. Okay, so let's look at the internal models, right? So you can see that every single model, we've got land of Nephi, we talked about, land of Zarahemla, narrow strip of wilderness, and the land of Bountiful, east sea to the west sea, east sea to the west sea. They've all got the same general picture. We can really assume that there's east sea and west sea. And when the battles of Bountiful happen, right, it talks about the east sea specifically. So we really can gather from other scriptures that it definitely runs from the east sea to the west sea. Okay, so how do our models do as far as that? Okay. Let's go to the Heartland Model. Okay, so the Heartland Model, land of Bountiful, is typically said to be kind of in the Ohio Valley, right, where all the Adana and Hopewell kind of heartland is. But some people put it up here kind of closer to there, right, because this can be their narrow neck, so it's everything just kind of south of that narrow neck. But if this is the narrow neck of land here, then the land of Bountiful has to be like here. So then in that case, it's like now we've kind of switched. So if we're going to put it up here, then now we make the West Sea here, right? Whereas we already learned that like the land of Zarahemla and land of Nephi also went from the East Sea to the West Sea. And it's like, well, they definitely, if this is your West Sea, you have to like shift your seas because the land of Zarahemla and Nephi have no West Sea. It's like, what? So this is the West Sea, but now this is the West Sea? Once again, you kind of have to twist things a little bit to make that work. And like read the scripture yourself and you'll see it really doesn't fit great. That's one of the weaknesses of the Heartland. The Heartland's great strengths, right, are the not having to have two Comoras and all this stuff that are spectacular aspects of their model. So let's go to the Sorensen model, the Grijalva, or the Sumacinta as well. So from here, the land of Bountiful, this is their land of Bountiful from East Sea to the West Sea, right, and their city Bountiful ends up being there. I mean, that works, even though, especially when it comes to Tehuantepec here, those seas now become like North Seas and South Seas. But, I mean, they're part of greater oceans, right? We still call this the Pacific Ocean, even though it's, because it's connected to that whole Western Pacific Sea. So we could still make it work, right? The directions actually still work on the seas, even though they're a little bit wacky. Does the land of Bountiful go from the East Sea to the West Sea? Sure, right? And the Rio Pasión model, which I'll have to make a diagram of that. I don't have it. But they actually have this is the West Sea, and this is the East Sea, right? They make this their West Sea, this their East Sea. I'm not even really going to cover that very much in this model because it has some significant problems. But I'm going to interview. We're going to talk to the guys who created that because we want to give everyone a chance to kind of defend their model, right? And so then in my model as well, we've got the land of Bountiful being up here. Let's see. Let's go to the bigger thing here, right? The land of Bountiful, East Sea, the West Sea. So my city of Bountiful, right, is up here in the West Neck lands, and then it stretches all the way over to Puerto Vallarta and the west coast, which I make my case for. It's really one of the most bountiful parts of all of Mexico. West Mexico is kind of one of the breadbaskets of Mexico, just like the Sacramento Valley. It's got an incredible climate to grow crops in, especially vegetables. Okay, so East Sea to West Sea. So mine has an East Sea to West Sea. definitely that's a strength of mind model. But let's keep going. So the next one is there is a seashore west of both the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi, which is near the Lehite land of first inheritance. Okay, this is something I want to hit home on. But let's just read the quote. All right, it says, they were spread through the wilderness on the west in the land of Nephi, yea, also on the west of the land of Zarahemla. This is where so the Nephites are kind of living in tents in the wilderness on the west of Nephi and in the land of west of Zarahemla. And it even says on the east and the west, right, because they're completely surrounded by it. If you read the entire Alma 22:28, you can go to that and kind of, we'll cover it in here in a second. But check on it. On the west of the land of Zarahemla, in the borders of the seashore, on the west of the land of Nephi, in the place of their father's first inheritance, and thus bordering along the seashore, right? Which seashore? I mean, the only seashore we're talking about here is west, right? So the west seashore. Okay, let's just read it one more time really specifically so you can, I just want to hammer home this point, right? The Lamanites were spread through the wilderness on the west, right? On the west of the land, in the land of Nephi, yea, and also on the west of the land of Zarahemla, okay? In the borders by the seashore. Which seashore? We're definitely talking about the west seashore. And on the west in the land of Nephi, in the place of their father's first inheritance, thus bordering along the seashore. Did we bring in a south seashore here? Like, is there any other direction other than west? Go read the whole chapter. No, it never says anything about a south sea or a north sea in this section. We're only talking about east seas and west seas, right? So the place of their father's first inheritance. And like I said, there is another verse that we could hit that even draws this conclusion stronger, that shows that the land of the father's first inheritance was on the west sea. So then, once again, this is a real weakness, because let's go here to the Heartland Model. So their land of first inheritance, I've heard sometimes them put it in Florida, or other times them put it here, other times maybe over here. But it's always on the south. It's always on the south. And it's not on the west in the land of Nephi, right? It's kind of, maybe you could say it's in the southwest and he just wasn't being clear enough. But once again, like, there's so many, we can make anything fit if we do enough mental gymnastics. And this will be like a reoccurring theme as we go through everything. And if no other model like fits yours better, then sometimes it's like, well, you have to do the mental gymnastics, because maybe Mormon and Moroni, it's not like they had Google Earth. Like, the ancients' understanding of geography was not anything like even an 8-year-old who has Google Earth today. They see the spatial relationships, they understand them completely. Back then, the only thing people had to go to work with was like their personal experience with the land, which typically helped them really understand north versus south and east versus west, right? Like a picture of, like, I live here in Utah. Let's say that in Utah, I've never seen Google Earth. I didn't know anything. I walked over to the sea. I would know that if the sea was east or south, right? But I wouldn't be able to draw that shoreline very well unless I'd walked, I would have no idea. I just know that it was that direction. I'd be pretty good at knowing that this city's north, this city's south, this city's east, this city's west, but I would not be very good at knowing exactly how mountains run, and I wouldn't be very good at knowing shorelines. And that shows when you look at ancient maps, right? When you look at maps before they really had tools to chart the stars and chart shorelines, which is like pre-Renaissance, right? Any map before like 1000 AD, they're not so good, but they're fair. Okay, so let's move on. So we are now looking for, in the land of Zarahemla, so we got to make sure that we hit home that the land of first inheritance is along the West Sea. So first inheritance is around here, I believe, in the Grijalva model. I think both of them kind of put it along the shoreline, some a little further south, some a little further north. But yeah, in this area. And Usumacinta is the same, and honestly, mine is pretty much the same, right? I have kind of the same thing. My first inheritance is kind of the same way. That's along the West Sea. And I don't know whether I think the first inheritance could be here and it could be here. I have my different thoughts and ideas. If you have ideas, put them in the comments. But I'll tell you that my thought is that the Lehites landed further south than when Nephi first landed, and that there's actually kind of that their land of first inheritance is everything south and west of the land of Nephi, but that they kind of don't differentiate between the Lehite first inheritance, where everybody landed, but then Nephi got warned in a dream that his brothers are probably going to try and kill him again, and so he needs to hightail it out of there, and so he obviously fled a ways, right? And maybe he took the ship to go a little further north, or maybe he didn't, but he did take the sword of Laban and a bunch of stuff that really made him mad. But I think that we can suspect that where Nephi went into the land of Nephi and kind of made his first inheritance, is a little bit different than where Laman did. But we know that after he went and founded the city of Nephi, I mean, it was within that 50 years when Jacob is already saying, well, the Lamanites are coming and trying to kill us. So they found him, right? They tracked him down and they found him. So it can't be that far. It's not like they went 1,000 miles. My guess is they probably went a couple hundred miles. And the Lamanites probably used native guides and stuff to kind of track them down and find out where they went. So anyway, land of first inheritance in mind. It's kind of, I would say that the Lehites probably landed here to begin with, and then that they traveled up about, I mean, it's only like 70 miles to this region right here. I think they probably took the boat, honestly. I think they either built their own boat or took the boat that they had, re-landed, and then went up into the mountains to try and find a place where their crops could grow, right? So they needed to find some place that was a little more arid because their crops wouldn't grow down in the jungle. Okay, so those are the three there. Let's move on to the next one. I think that's an important point, though. You can see which model has the stronger point. Okay, the next one. The Lamanites and Nephites were divided not only by the narrow strip of wilderness, but by the borders of Manti and the head of the Riverside, which seems to be running from east to west, just like the narrow strip of wilderness it's associated with. Okay, this is a crazy important point. Okay, now let's read the scripture really carefully, and I want you to get clear in your mind what this is saying. Okay, when it talks about which way the Riverside is flowing, right? Which way it's running. Okay, so it says they're divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness which ran from the sea east to the sea west. We already went over that, right? Land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla divided by a narrow strip of wilderness, and that narrow strip of wilderness runs from the east sea to the west sea, right? And it says, and roundabout on the borders of the seashore and the borders of wilderness, which is on the north by the land of Zarahemla. Okay, so it's saying the Lamanites also run about the borders of the seashore in a wilderness, which was on the north by the land of Zarahemla. In this case, it doesn't say whether it's talking about running around the east to the north or running around the west to the north, but we know that there's a wilderness kind of running around probably both sides because it talks about that in another little section. But this is the important part right here. Through the borders of Manti by the head of the river Sidon, running from the east toward the west, and thus were the Lamanites and the Nephites divided. Okay, I want to read. I'm going to read this entire chapter. Right, I know it's confusing, but step through it with me, and just as you read it, picture each of the models and what they're saying and whether they fit. Okay, we're going to go through and actually read through this specific verse, 27. Okay, and it came to pass that the king sent a proclamation throughout all the land amongst his people who were in all his land, who were in all the regions round about, which was bordering even to the sea on the east and on the west, right? His land of Nephi, runs from the east sea to the west sea, which was divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness, which ran from the east sea to the west sea. We've covered all of that, right? You're with me? So we're all on the same page here. But his land also was roundabout on the borders of the seashore and the borders of the wilderness, which was on the north by the land of Zarahemla. So the king of the Lamanites, his land doesn't just go from the east sea to the west sea. It goes up on the north, right, around the land of Zarahemla. That makes sense? And this will be really important in a second here, because we're going to talk about how that after they do this unprovoked attack, that Moroni, Captain Moroni, then is like, okay, we're building a new border. And he builds this new border that goes from the east sea to the west sea. And he pushes the Lamanites out of the wildernesses that run up on the north, on the east, and the west. That's what this is talking about, right? Before he makes that new border, they run up in the north around the land of Nephi. Okay, so roundabout on the borders of the seashore, the borders of the wilderness, which is on the north by the land of Zarahemla. Okay, there's Lamanites on the north by the land of Zarahemla. Through the borders of Manti. Okay, so now we're going down around the borders of Manti by the head of the river Sidon, running from the east toward the west, and thus the Lamanites. So what is it talking about there, running from the east to the west? It sure sounds to me that it's saying that the head of the river Sidon is running from the east toward the west. Right? And this really makes sense, right? So I think that the initial border between the Lamanites and the Nephites was the narrow strip of wilderness and the river Sidon. That the river Sidon ran through that narrow strip of wilderness from the east to the west, right? Because up here we have the narrow strip of wilderness runs from the east sea even to the west sea. But here it's saying the river Sidon, which is running from the east toward the west. So both of them kind of go from the east to the west, and that is the border between the Nephites and the Lamanites. This is a super important point. Tongue twister. Okay, so, and I want to also follow too, like I have another section here where we talk about, like we can go to the dictionary, the 1830 dictionary of what a head of a river is, right? And it's pretty clear. In fact, let's just do it really quick right now. head of Sidon. I know that I have a section here that actually says what the head of the River Sidon is. Just click on this. It'll take you down here. You can see so Sidon head is defined in Webster's 1828 dictionary as to originate, to spring, to have its source, as in a river. Also noun, the part most remote or opposite from the mouth or opening into the sea, right? So we've got the mouth being like the delta, the head being the opposite of that mouth, right? The head being the headwaters, right? The spring, as in head of a bay, right? Opposite the opening, gulf or creek. Also noun, the principal source of a stream, as in the head of Nile, right? The source of the Nile. The head of a river is not the mouth of a river. Okay, attempting to make it such is a wild stretch. It's the opposite of a mouth. If you don't believe me, once again, just go to it yourself. This is the 1828 dictionary, so this is the most widely used way of speaking in that time period. Right? We can just use this to know how they would have thought of the word head, how Joseph Smith would have thought of the word head, the uppermost part of the human body. But when it's talking about a river, what is that one down here? Just like look for spring and you'll see these definitions that I already gave you if you don't believe me, right? To originate, to spring, to have its source as in a river, right? Anyway, all that stuff is directly out of here. You can, if you don't believe me, go wade through it yourself. To originate, to spring, to have its source as in a river, the part most remote opposite from the mouth, the opening to the sea. It's right there in the dictionary. Okay, so I know that a lot of times they try and make the head of the river into something else. And sure, I mean, you can do that. Like I said, we can do all sorts of word plays with all these crazy things. But you just need to realize that you're doing a little bit of mental gymnastics, and it's not the most that's not the best explanation or interpretation of the verse, right? If you're gonna try and stretch it. Okay, so let's just go back one more time, and let me just make this point one more time. Okay, that Manti is by the head, right? The source, the spring, the beginning of the River Sidon. That the river runs from the east toward the west, right? Almost certainly this is talking about the River Sidon and not like the land of Zarahemla. It could maybe be talking about the borders of Manti, but I mean, it sure seems like it's clarifying the head of the River Sidon, run from the east to the west, and thus were the Lamanites and Nephites divided. Okay, so let's just go through the different scriptures and the different models. We will start with the Heartland Model, right? Okay, so we already talked about the narrow strip of wilderness, right? It has to be between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla, and like I said, sometimes they put this land of Bountiful up here and maybe extend the land of Zarahemla over into the Hopewell of the Ohio Valley, which they should, right? The way I have it drawn here, which is the way that I've seen it on a lot of their sites, that just does not fit the geography. So the narrow strip of wilderness has to go between all these lands, but like we said with the River Sidon here, a lot of times they're trying to make the River Sidon like the Tennessee River, right? Because their land of Nephi is like a site that's actually under a reservoir on the Tennessee River, right? In one of these Tennessee valleys, which once again, that just doesn't work. It has to be kind of south of the land of Zarahemla, but this is the big thing. Like when it comes to that head of the River Sidon, right? Then the head is not a confluence. Like I've seen quite a few models where they're trying to say that the head of the River Sidon is the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. That is, once again, total mental gymnastics. You cannot change. I mean, that's almost as bad as what I've seen with some of them where they try and make the West Sea into the Mississippi River. Like pretending that they don't know the difference between a river and a sea and they like got their words mixed up or something. It's like, no, the West Sea needs to be west of the land of Nephi. It's a major issue. There's really the only choice you have when it comes to that is these ones who try and say the Mississippi River used to come up into the Mississippi Valley, right? That there used to be like an ancient extension of the Gulf of Mexico that went way up the Mississippi Valley. But once again, like that does not work. We can go right here to my archaeology map. We can look at sites from before the time of Christ here, right? There's tons of them. Like there are incredibly like important large sites that have not been under the sea that are from before the time of Christ, right? Like Watson Break, Crook's Mound, like these are down in the plain, down in the floodplain essentially. Those sites wouldn't have existed if the ocean went up the Mississippi River before the time of Christ and then somehow changed at these like destructions at the time of Christ. It's just a problem, and I guess everyone can do their mental gymnastics to try and come around that, but there's problems with every single one of those explanations. But at least with what we're talking about right now, at least with this head of Sidon, let's just talk about the head of Sidon has to be kind of in the narrow strip of wilderness between the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi, should be running from east to west. So then we should at least say, instead of saying it's the confluence, we should at least say that the head of Sidon is like the Missouri and Platte rivers, right? And I mean, that at least kind of makes sense, because the Missouri River, with the Ohio, but the Missouri probably is the number one tributary to the Mississippi River. So if the Mississippi is your Sidon and the Missouri is your head of Sidon, and Manti, where Joseph Smith said it was, which for reasons that I talked about in another video, I think. But if you believe that where he said Manti was, which isn't actually an archaeological site, but Huntsville, Illinois, if you think that really was Manti, at least it's kind of on like one of the headwaters of the Mississippi River, right? The Missouri. So at least that works, even though it doesn't work well, right? But let's move on to the other models just really quick, go through them. Your head of Sidon in the Grijalva model, right? Sorensen's Grijalva model. Does it go from east to west? Maybe a teeny bit, like maybe this tiny little arm, you could say, did. Right, and his Sidon is, or his Manti is the site of La Libertad. And so this one that I have drawn here actually isn't even the main tributary. Well, I mean, it is the main tributary, but it's not the tributary that Sorensen claims is the main tributary of the Grijalva River. He has it right here in, La Libertad, this tiny little one here. And it doesn't really even have a branch that goes from east to west when we're using, like that Nephite north, right? So, which is really confusing. So that would actually mean it needs to come from this way, from east to west. That doesn't really work with Nephite north. But so then they would have to explain that away and say it's just talking about the strip of wilderness again that's running from east to west. So anyway, not great as far as that little clause goes and their match. Let's go to the Usumacinta. The Usumacinta, its main tributary, it's about here. Does that go from east to west? It actually goes from west to east. So opposite of what it is. So once again, they would have to do the same thing as all the other ones and say that clause was like redundantly clarifying the narrow strip of wilderness and not the actual Riverside. And the Rio Pasión, so that one actually does work, right? Rio Pasión, I mean, it has kind of two tributaries. One of them is here, but there's another one that actually goes up into here. All of them are not great, right? But maybe it's a small detail that isn't as big. So we're gonna look at my model right here, right? My east to west, like I'm saying the entire Riverside, like when it's clarifying that the entire Riverside was the boundary initially between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla. And I think that is kind of proven by the number of times, there's 3 different instances where the point of interception of the Nephite armies is the Riverside. It's like every time the Nephites, before Moroni makes this new border we're going to talk about here in a second, every time the Lamanites kind of come into the land and take off, they try and intercept them like on the Riverside. It really kind of makes sense that it's this boundary. And not only that, just the language that's used. Let me take these off. Just the language that's used by calling it the Riverside in the first place, right? I have reasons for this. I show in some of my other videos how there's just this strong Assyrian presence in the artwork, especially in sites in the Gulf where the Amalekites are, right? So the Amalekites, which I have here in the Gulf, right by some of these early Olmec sites, especially La Venta, right? I have that imagery where there's the anthropomorphic bird with the purse, which comes right out of an Assyrian temple. Right, and that makes sense because the Amalekites lived in the hill country, it says in the Bible. The Amalekites lived in the land of Ephraim in the hill country, in that exact area where that temple comes from, right? So I'm talking about the biblical Amalekites. So I think it's no coincidence that the Book of Mormon people are calling the Amalekites because they are Assyrians. Like that was their name for this kind of like proto-Assyrian group or some kind of subset of the Assyrian Empire that actually came to the Americas. They recognized these are Amalekites coming from the old world, so they call them Amalekites here in the new world as well, right? And the archaeology like shows that in my model, which is, I mean, holy cow, bullseye, like such an amazing match. And then not only that, those Amalekites that stretched all the way over into the Philistine coast, I believe that the border that kind of like separated the Amalekites from the land of Ephraim in the old world, in Israel, right, was kind of the city of Sidon. So Sidon right there on the coast of Israel. And so then when that came into the New World, the Mulekites, the people of Zarahemla, who kind of are the ones probably that named the Amalekites for the first time because they knew they kind of came over at the same time, right? And they're from the same region, the northern tribes. So they call the Riverside, which is the border between kind of these two regions, they call the Riverside because it is the separator between their lands and the Amalekite regions. Just like in the Old World, the separator between Israel and the Amalekites was the city of Sidon, right? Or at least kind of that parallel, that latitude. So, I mean, it's amazing the parallels that you can draw. And this is like my model, one thing after another lines up in this way. Like things that are just, like, is that a coincidence? Like, what are the chances of that? And everything just ends up matching in ways that are spectacular. But like I say, my Riverside, right, Rio Balsas, has two main tributaries, right? One of them is kind of up here and goes right next to the city of Cholula, which is my Zarahemla, right? And my, anyway, I'll get into Zarahemla in a little bit in my model because I believe that the city that the king of Zarahemla, right, of the Mulekites, that Mosiah did not inherit his city, didn't take over his city. I believe that he gave him a new city, which ended up becoming the capital, and they were actually a little different, right? One's Chalcansingo, that's to the south, down in the basin, that's really down, like most of the land is Zarahemla, this big depression, the Grijalva Depression, the Balsas Depression, and then this other one up a little higher where Cholula is. But in general, it just runs from east to west, and even here in Manti, like this entire, you can see my head of Sidon that I've drawn here, there's kind of like this highland region where a lot of the tributaries of this southern branch of the Balsas River branch off of. Okay, so anyway, there's mine. People can judge it the same way I'm judging others, but everyone can make up their mind on what they think is the strongest parallel there. But anyway, either way, let's go back to the text and kind of hit the next point. And God, this is so important. This next point, I think, is the most important point in all Book of Mormon geographies, and almost no one talks about it. Okay, it's I really want to get this word out. Like, share this to your friends. Get the word out that this is the most important part and that you need to address it. Okay, so everyone addresses Alma 22 to some extent, even though the Heartlanders kind of gloss over it because it doesn't fit their model very well because of that darn West Sea, right? But it's kind of the starting point that most people start on. The next point you got to go to is Moroni's new border of Alma 50, 51, and really through 57, all the wars that are fought by Moroni, which have such amazing directionality indicators in them, right? They all start from the starting point of the new border. Okay, let's read about it really quick right here. So let's read in the article so that you can follow along, and then we'll go right to the scriptures. So it says, understanding the relationships between the cities involved in Moroni's new border, right, of Alma 50, 51, is one of the most important aspects of the internal model of Book of Mormon. Alma 50, 7 through 15 details the creation of this new border between the Nephite and Lamanite lands, and Moroni's fortification of it with garrison cities, which run between the southern border of the land of Zarahemla and the northern border of the land of Nephi, which Alma 58 says runs in a straight course from east sea to the west, right? And we'll see that it implies the West Sea because it talks about a city by the sea in those battles, right? Read carefully through Alma 50 and pay close attention to the wording and the logic concerning these new border fortifications. Okay, and I'm going to actually go to these scriptures just so you don't think that I am somehow misquoting. But let's start with this, where I've paraphrased the entire section of those 4 verses, okay, so that you really see what's going on. So it says, and we're talking about Moroni here, and he also placed armies on the south, right? South of where? South of Zarahemla. In the borders of their possessions, right? Of the Nephite possessions, of course. Placed armies in the south, the land of Zarahemla, in the borders of their Nephite possessions, and caused them to erect fortifications that they might secure their people, fortifying the line between the Nephites and the Lamanites, between the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi, from the West Sea, running by the head of the River Sidon, to the foundation of a city, and they called Moroni, and it was by the East Sea. Okay, so did you follow that? He creates a new border, right? If we go to this, we'll see this is after he kicks out the Nephites, because right in Alma 22 he talks about how they're nearly surrounded by Lamanites. They're going up along the east and the west coast. So after this attack, kind of this unprovoked attack that the Lamanites wage against the Nephites, then he comes and he's building all these new fortifications, right? And he prepares strongholds against the coming of their enemies, right? And he caused his army to go forth in the east wilderness. They went forth and drove all the Lamanites who were in the east wilderness into their own lands, which was south of the land of Zarahemla. Okay, do you follow what's going on here? And you understand how this would really make the Lamanites mad? I mean, you could see both sides of the story here. The Lamanites start this war because he's like, he drove them all, he stole their lands. But he's like, well, yeah, that's because they were sitting here, they were squatting in kind of our region. But as soon as you attacked us, I am going to fortify our border, right? Lay the smack down. And so they get mad and start this entire war. Okay, but look, so, and the land of Nephi did run in a straight course from the sea east to the west, right? We already have in Alma 22 that it talks about the West Sea. So people are saying, well, look, it only talks about an East Sea, there's not a West Sea. No, read Alma 22, there's a West Sea, right? And it came to pass that when Moroni had driven all the Lamanites out of the east wilderness, which was north of the land of their own possessions, whose possessions? Probably the Lamanites' possessions, right? So all the Lamanites who are north of the main land of Nephi, he drives them out. He caused that the inhabitants who are in the land of Zarahemla and in the roundabout should go into the east wilderness, even to the borders by the seashore. Kicks them out, puts Nephites there, creates this new border, creates garrison cities. He also placed armies on the south in the border of their possessions and caused them to erect fortifications that they might secure their armies and people from the hands of their enemies. Same thing we're talking about, right? He's fortifying that new border between the Nephites and the Lamanites that now no longer wraps up around the Nephite lands. And we're going to look at people's models, be like, why would it wrap up around their lands in the first place? Right? I mean, look at, once again, my model. We've got these lowlands right here that wrap up along the Mexican highland. So it absolutely makes sense that the Nephites would have surrounded the Lamanites would have surrounded the Nephites as they came up those coastal corridors in those lowlands, right? But then when he creates this new border, he kicks them out of those lowlands and builds cities on it. Whereas we're going to go through other models and see, like, does that really make sense? Why it would even be that way in the first place? Okay. And thus he cut off all the strongholds of the Lamanites in the east wilderness, yea, and also on the west. Okay, so there's an east wilderness, but they are wrapping up along the east and the west. So he cut off all the stronghold of the Lamanites, kicks them out of the land, fortifying the land between the Nephites and the Lamanites, between the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi, from the west sea running by the head of the Riverside. The Nephites possessing all the land northward, even all the land which is northward of the land bountiful, according to their pleasure, right? So the Nephites own everything to the north. Once again, let's just look in my model, kind of comparing that. So the Nephites are owning everything up here. Let's go to kind of, so the Nephites are trying to claim everything to the north, right? And I'll talk about my idea of kind of like how their view that the Gulf of Mexico kind of came in a little bit more than it did. Every model has real issues with the narrow neck. We're going to deal with that on its own in a second here. But we can see the land of Nephi. The Nephites went all the way up and around on the east and on the west, right? And so he kicks them out and makes a straight line. Okay, let's read a little bit further and then let's go to other people's models because some things work and some things don't. Okay, thus Moroni with his armies, which did increase daily because of the assurance of protection which his works did bring unto them, did seek to cut off the strength and the power of the Lamanites from the lands of their possessions, that they should have no power of the lands of their possession, the lands of Nephi possession, right? They shouldn't be able to take over any of their land. And it came to pass that the Nephites began a foundation of a city, and they called the name of the city Moroni, and it was by the east sea. And it was on the south by the line of the possessions of the Lamanites, right? Which is clarifying right up here when it's talking about the land of their own possessions, right? So it was on the east sea and it was on the south by the line of the possession of the Lamanites. Okay, so we're talking about the same thing. He's creating that new border, and there's one right on the ocean called Moroni. And he also began the foundation for a city between the city of Moroni and the city of Aaron, joining the borders of Aaron and Moroni, and they called the name of the city Nephiha, right? So he built a second city along the new border, right? And they also began that same year to build many cities on the north. One in particular manner they called Lehi, which was on the north by the borders of the seashore. So now kind of north of Moroni and north of Moroni and Nephiha, they're building some more cities on the borders of the seashore, right? And it says in another verse, the east seashore. It clarifies, right? Lehi is along the east seashore. If you doubt that, like I say, and all these things, if you doubt them, go to my main thing here, and like I said, I've got like every single city and every single reference to it. Just or just search it up yourself. It's up to you, but I kind of try and make it simple here. Okay, so let's talk about that really quick. We'll go in my model. We'll just see what I'm saying here. So he builds the new border. Old border is the Riverside, essentially, right? That's the original border in that narrow strip of wilderness. That's what the picture that's painted in Alma 22. Then after this attack, Moroni expands the border, moves it south, kicks everybody out of the east and the west wilderness, builds garrison cities, Moroni, right? Nephiha, somewhere in here. Lehi, Morianton, all these other new cities to the north of those cities, you can kind of debate exactly where they are. And we're going to see that there are other cities that are fought in these same wars, right? Because this huge war starts right after Alma 50. And there's an eastern front and a western front. And the western front details the armies of Helaman, right? The 2,000 stripper warriors, and how they're retaking the city of Antipyrah, Cumanai, Manti, Judea, and how they go to a city by the sea, and it's all west by the sea. Like, this made really, really clear, right? So this new border is super important, right? Because it does go from the East Sea to the West Sea, and we have every single kind of city across the way named in these war chapters. And one of the most important that we have to go through is Manti, because there are 3 scriptures that put Manti in proximity to Nephiha, right? And I go over this really quick, just right down from here, right? Alma 59, 5-7, Alma 56 show this incredibly important proximity between the southern border cities of Manti and the head of Sidon and Nephiha. I mean, just look at it right here. Let's read it just so you can understand that Nephiha is somewhat close to Manti. Not right next to it, but somewhat close to it. Came to pass that Moroni, while thus making preparations to go into the Lamanites' battle, behold, the people of Nephiha, who were gathered together from the city of Moroni and the city of Lehi that had been attacked at this point in Alma 59, the city of Morianton, were attacked by the Lamanites, yea, and those who had been compelled to flee from the land of Manti, right, round about, had come over and joined the Lamanites in this part of the land. So we have the people going from Nephiha, or from Manti to Nephiha. We have this proximity set up right there. And it's not the only one, right? There's these other ones too that talk about the proximity, like where it says, neither durst they, right here, neither durst they march down against the city of Zarahemla, neither durst they cross the head of Sidon over to the city of Nephiha. And this is talking about Lamanites that are sitting in the city of Manti, right? So we're once again making this close proximity between Nephiha and Manti. Not close enough that they can just easily march over there, but close enough that it's like that's their next big option, right? And it's probably somewhat similar, the distance to Zarahemla and the distance to Nephiha, right? Because that's the choices they're making. Probably a little closer to Nephiha, because Zarahemla, if they're going to march down to that, they're going to meet a lot of resistance. And so you can think of the calculations they're making in their mind here and come up with proximities to that. So you can see in my model how important that is really quick. Manti and Nephiha, Manti and Zarahemla, they're somewhat similar distances. I'm thinking that Nephiha is closer, and I'm not sure whether it's up on the plateau or down in the valley. You can kind of make that judgment there, but I've got 2 amazing cities that are both absolutely fortified. They are fortresses, just like Manti is a fortress, just like Antipyrah and Cumanai are fortresses. These are all mixed tech things in Mayan lands that right at 100 BC, the archaeology shows that they abandoned their valley cities and then built these fortresses up on the hill, just like the Book of Mormon says, right? Because they're building this new border. And that mixed tech land in my model, the mixed tech lands become fortresses and kind of a borderland between the Zapotec Empire and the Teotihuacan Empire ever after, right? That from 100 BC, probably even before 100 BC, it's kind of like a frontier area because there are fortresses that are built even before that. But then it spans all the way into Aztec times. Really, the Aztecs and the Zapotecs kind of have this like soft border between them that's fortified. And all of these East Coast cities, absolutely fortresses. A lot of them are called fortresses, like Quetzaltep Fortress. I mean, there's like 4 of them that they're called fortresses. Okay, so let's go through other people's models and just see if that fits the Book of Mormon. So where is Moroni's new border in the Heartland Model? Okay, I've never seen a single person talk about it because they haven't really read those parts of the scriptures enough to study it out. Like I said, this is one of the serious weaknesses of the Heartland Model, which I love. I love the Heartland Model. It's so important because, the 2 Cumorah theory is poor. Like, you had to have a Heartland Model if you're coming up with 2 Cumorahs because there's so much evidence about the Nephites being in the Midwest. There's so much evidence, both Joseph Smith's quotes, early prophetic quotes. He is very, very sure that the Nephites existed in North America, and there's a lot of archaeological support for it, and there's a lot of spiritual support for it, and there's a lot of scriptural support as far as the land of America and how it would rate. Like in my model, this is the land of Mulek. So I'm so happy that the Heartland Model exists. It needs to exist because it needs to push back against this idea that everything happened in Mesoamerica and North America and the U.S., does not play a part in the Book of Mormon narrative, because it absolutely does. Like, the land of Mulek is incredibly important. The land of Northward, incredibly important. Only one Cumorah. But this line that we're talking about that goes all the way from the city by the sea, right? It mentions the city by the sea in the, go look it up, in the wars with the 2,000 Striplin warriors, right? This line of cities has to go from the West Sea to the East Sea. So then the only way we can make that work in the Heartland Model is to make the city by the sea down here, because there's no sea over here, and there's no way it's over here on the West Coast, right? These are things that can be traversed like within a couple weeks, not like a year, not like 3,000 miles. And I have no doubt they could travel that long. It's just read the narrative. They don't. Like, it kind of gives you an idea of how long these armies are traveling. So we have to put the city by sea, Antipyra, Judea, Cumeni, Manti, and then Manti has to be close enough to Nephihah, where they need Durst. They go from Manti to Nephihah. They're making a choice to go. Are they going to go between Manti and Zarahemla, or Manti and Nephihah? Like, that makes no sense. That makes no sense. And we know Nephihah is between between Aaron and Moroni. And we have these armies that go from Moroni up to, Lehi, Moranton, Omner, Gid, which it says all of which were by the EC. So then you have to either put them here or here. But here doesn't really work, because it's like, well, how is that a border? Now you're going between. Now you've put all of these sites that are in the Ohio Valley, these amazing Hopewell sites that definitely match with Book of Mormon ages, which I believe really are. They are total Book of Mormon sites, both before the time of Christ and the time after the time of Christ. Now you've put them in the Lamanite lands. They're not even in the Nephite lands, because you've got your EC cities here, up here by this east. Man, you just run into so many problems. Read those chapters. Like, there's 2 different chapters where they're going between Moroni and Bountiful. And it says that Bountiful and Mulek are a day apart. And so then once again, it's like, well, we have to read those chapters of Alma, 50, 51, and be like, well, okay, how does it get from Mulek to Bountiful? Because Tian comes fighting this Bountiful, this sea, and he tells him to go fortify Bountiful, from Mulek, and he fights between the two. Go read those yourselves. They'll make your head hurt. This is like 700 miles. Try and make that fit within the narrative. It doesn't. Once again, you can use mental gymnastics to make anything fit, but it's not a good fit. But once again, I love the Heartland Model. Holy cow. It absolutely is so important because of all their strengths, which is that the Book of Mormon, like the Man of Mulek, final battles, everything happens up in here. Okay, so the Grijalva and Usumacinta models. Let's look at that same logic here, right? So if the border used to be Sidon, sure, we can kind of make that. We'd already talked about the narrow strip of wilderness is actually great in their model, because there is really a great narrow strip of wilderness there. But now we have to have this city, right? There has to be a Moroni, and it has to be by the EC. We went over that. Check the video, check the verses. Moroni is built by the EC, and Nephihah is built between it and Aaron. Aaron is actually close to Ammonihah, because he makes a journey from Ammonihah to Aaron. So look at the way that he resolves these. And I could walk you through these, and I will in another video. You're going to have to check them out for yourself a little bit, but look at this. So he puts Ammonihah up here, and then he puts Aaron over here, because we know that in Alma's missionary journeys, right, between Ammonihah, he travels between Aaron and Ammonihah. So we know they're in fairly close proximity, right? But in the verse we just read, it says that Nephihah was built between Moroni and Aaron. So then that's why he's putting it like that. But now how on earth is that guarding between the land of the Nephites and the land? Like, they have to have the Nephites or the Lamanites stretching all the way up in this area, because it says that these cities are by the EC, right? But now it makes no sense, because we just barely read how important it is that Manti be close to Nephihah, because it says neither durst they march, take their journey across the Riverside to Nephihah. We know that those are in proximity. That's like 250 miles apart. There's no close proximity to that. Like, why? It makes no sense when it comes to those scriptures that talk about the proximity of Manti and Nephihah. And once again, you can make it work. You can do a little mental gymnastics. You can be like, well, it's sure they just had to go totally roundabout, 300 miles, and you can make anything work, but it's not the clearest reading. And that's obvious because all of our internal models, right? Independent internal models. Did they do that? No. They have Moroni over here by the East Sea, right? This one here, this one here, this one here, right? They put Manti down by the south. They put Manti. They all are fairly similar, not because they saw each other. Like I made one in 10th grade the first time I read the Book of Mormon, and it's pretty dang similar. I did these same relationships because when you read the book text, it's like, oh yeah, that's what it says. They're all kind of on this south narrow strip of wilderness area as kind of a line of guardian cities, a fortified garrison city. Like I said, I think I have in here there's mine that I made in 10th grade. So this is me as like a 15-year-old kid drawing my own model without using the other people's. Before the internet even existed, right? We didn't even have any books that really talked about this, and I'm like drawing my model and it matches the other guys' models because the internal model is pretty consistent. Does that look like the Heartland? Does it look like Sorensen's model? No. Does it look like my model? I mean, it's actually closer to my model than the other ones, but it still doesn't even look like my model, right? It's like the internal model. This is the model. I think this is Moroni's map and Mormon's map. This is what they had in their head of what the land southward looked like, even though they were from the land northward. They'd been south enough to like kind of have a general idea, and this is the idea that they had. All right, God, I belabored this point long enough. Holy cow. I'm sure you're completely bored. If you haven't dropped off already, way to go. You must really be interested in Book of Mormon Geography if you're sitting through all this garbage. If my wife was here, man, she would be like dying. She'd be like, "King me, this is way too much information I don't care about." Okay, but for people who care about this stuff, let's keep going, right? Let's keep all of us geography nerds who are still like hanging out trying to figure this out. We can form the Geography Nerd Club. All right, so let's see. We already went through, where am I at? We already went through that and that. I'm just going to read this last thing really quick. I'm going to read this last paragraph so we can hit these points home. We've been through the models. We see how they fit. Okay, so the wars of Alma 52 to Alma 56 detail the geography of this new southern border by explaining the army maneuvers between the southeast and southwest frontier garrison cities. Alma 56 to 58 details the defense of the southwest border cities, right? In the west, that's where the armies of Helaman went. We went through that. From the city by the west seashore, right? If you don't believe it, here's links right here. The city by the seashore, and it's very clear that it's talking about the west seashore, to Judea, Antipyra, Cumanai, Zeezrom, and the south central frontier town of Manti at the head of the Riverside. And read the verses. This is all absolutely in there. And perhaps one of the most important details of the entire southern border is the fact that the town of Manti, while only a few days' march from the west city by the sea, right, which those wars made clear, only a few days' march between them, is also close enough to the east sea cities of Nephiha and Moroni that an army could reasonably march between the two in a short amount of time. Okay, big deal. Some people might disagree with that. Read it for yourself. Absolutely think that is totally set in the text. It's hard to get around. Both Alma 56 and Alma 59 and Alma 56 show the incredibly important proximity between the southern border city of Manti and the head of Riverside and Nephiha. Even before Moroni creates the new border, Alma 43-22 shows Manti is not far from the east coast city of Antionum. Okay, that's a huge one. In fact, let's just read that one really quick. Now behold, it came to pass they durst not come against the Nephites in the borders of Jershon, right? We're talking about the army that came from Antionum. Therefore, they departed out of the land of Antionum into the wilderness and took their journey round about in the wilderness away by the head of the river Sidon, that they might come into the land of Manti. So this is a third witness of the proximity between Nephiha, right, and Antionum, which is near that, on those east coast cities, and the land of Manti. Okay, 3 different scriptures that give that proximity, right? If you're going to believe in Sorensen's model, or even some of the Heartland models, you have to believe that when he says right here that after they tried to go to Jershon and they're like, all right, we're going to go roundabout in the wilderness to the head of Sidon, that they actually went like 300 miles in Sorensen's model, or like 700 miles in the Heartland model, unless we put those like Antionum up here, and we put all those East Coast cities up here, which once again comes up with its own problems, in addition to the fact that then it makes the whole Hopewell Lamanites instead of Nephites. anyway, and that's not it. There's more problems. I'll go over my other videos. There's problem after problem after problem. Anyway, whereas when you put them like here, Antionum, what I said, the Antionum totally makes sense because Amulites and Amalekites are always ganging up on each other. We already went through all this, right? Totally makes perfect sense. It's super awesome. And their archaeology shows these are all epiomics. They all have relationships to the old world. There's so much cool stuff. So much cool stuff. All right, let's go on. Okay, let me really quick. So Moroni also fortifies the east coast cities from Moroni to the new southern border all the way to Bountiful on the narrow pass, or the line Bountiful, which leads to the land northward, basically making a backward L defensive city to guard the Nephite southern frontier. The attention shown by Moroni in fortifying the east coast and not the west coast further suggests that the east coast posed a greater threat as a travel corridor and mode of entry for the Nephite lands. Okay, and that's something we see a lot because it even talks about what is it called? The West Wilderness is talked about as like a more of a wilderness than the East Wilderness even is. And I'll hit that in another point because I'm trying to remember what the name it gives for the West Wilderness is. It's not the Great Wilderness. I'll hit that in a second. So, but it definitely paints this picture that there's like a more severe wilderness on the west and kind of like a smaller wilderness on the east, because that's where all the attacks almost always come from, right? It's almost specifically saying that people are coming from the east. So that it kind of suggests that Zarahemla must be weighted a little bit more toward the east than the west on the continent. Okay, almost certainly because Zarahemla, as the Nephite center or heart of the Nephite lands, which is specified in those verses, was closer to the east coast than the west coast. As will be seen in a moment, these are vital details that make almost all existing geographic models, whether the Heartland and Mainland models, difficult to correlate with the text, because features like the Yucatan Peninsula and Mesoamerica models and the sheer width of the North American continent and the Great Lakes in the Heartland make the travels of the various armies in these new coast-to-coast southern divides borders spoken of in the chapters incredibly problematic. And let me just hit home one more time. Sumacinta model. I think it's really hard to get away from the idea of putting Moroni right here by Antionum, right, just on the border by the narrow strip of wilderness. Like, if you look up those scriptures, I make it pretty clear in other areas. I've already gone over it. Hopefully you can have in your head pretty solid. Moroni, we know it was on the East Sea, right? And we know it was built as a garrison between the Nephites and the Lamanites to kick out the ones that he kicked out that were wrapping up around his lands. Like, read it again. It says that clearly. Instead of put Moroni up here, no, like the Sorensons do, that absolutely does not work. And then, so even bigger. Okay, there's a scripture that's huge, because after the people come out of Antionum, right, Amalickiah and his army come out and they take Moroni, they take Lehi, Omner, Gid, Mulek, right, and then you have this kind of battle with Teancum, where he's sitting in the city Bountiful of Mulek, and Moroni sends a letter up to him, and he says, hey, make sure you fortify the city of Bountiful so that you don't let the Lamanites get around us so they can harass us on every side. Okay, and let's look that up really quick just because I want to make this point. Harass them on every side. There it is right there, and I just want you to read it so you know exactly what I'm talking about. 52:9. This is Moroni. And Moroni also sent orders unto Teancum that he should fortify the land Bountiful to secure the narrow pass which led into the land northward, lest the Lamanites should attain that point and should have power to harass them on every side. Okay, that's super important. So as long as he can fortify Bountiful and the narrow, it talks about like a narrow pass. If he can fortify this narrow pass at the land of Bountiful, he can keep them out of the land of Bountiful, because if they take the land of Bountiful, they will have power to harass them on every side. Okay? We all clear on that? Like, that is what this said. I'm not stretching the words of the truth or anything. That's what it's saying. So let's look really quick at these other models. So here we have Bountiful. Now, between Mulek and Bountiful, like, the armies are already at Mulek. And he says, defend the narrow pass, lest they have power to harass us on every side. Now, if they go from Mulek, I mean, if we put, let's say we put Mulek here, and we put all these cities here like we've talked about. And now we read that, and he's like, hurry, don't let them take Bountiful, because if they take that, they'll be able to harass us of our north country and harass us on every side. It's like, well, how? Like, that doesn't let them harass the land of Zarahemla. That's not a threat. Who cares if they take these cities? That's such a... it's so far from the land of Zarahemla. It makes no sense. Like, read all those war chapters again. You'll see this. Like, you'll just have to scratch your head and be like, what? Wait, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Like, how does that keep them from harassing them on every side? Let's compare that in Sorensen's model. So Bountiful's way up here, right? So if they've come out of the land of Antionum, and they've taken all of this land. This is all taken by the Lamanites, right? And now they've taken Moroni, Lehi, Omner, and they're sitting here in Mulek. And Moroni is down here in the west, fighting the war, and he sends a letter up to Teancum. He's like, don't let them take Manti, because if they take that pass, they'll be able to harass us on every side. It's like, well, they've already got this whole dang area, including Nephites. They've got this whole area. How on earth, and how does Jershon even make sense? Because why did they put the people, the Lamanites, into this land of Jershon where they're supposed to be like protecting them? How is that even protected? Sure, they did a crappy job protecting them because they took all these cities, right? And now they're sitting there at Bountiful, and he's like, they're going to harass us. They could already harass you on every side. Like, that statement makes no sense because they already got you completely surrounded, basically. I mean, even the placement of these cities as garrison cities to protect from the line of Zarahemla makes absolutely no sense in the Sorensen model, unless you do some crazy mental gymnastics, right? Which people do. Holy cow. So let's take this one. This one makes more sense. At least we got Moroni and this line that I've talked about from Alma 50. So they've taken all of this, though, and now we've got the same problem. They're sitting at Mulek. He's like, don't let them take the narrow pass, which would have to be here somewhere. So there's some kind of narrow pass between there. Because if they take that, they're going to harass us on every side. It's like, well, they're already harassing you on pretty much every side. Now I guess they'll be able to harass you here? I guess. I mean, that works better, but still, that's not great, right? And this is one of the things that really helped me gain more, for a long time on my model, which everything just works so much better. I didn't know. I thought, like, well, is Bountiful way up here? Like, is this the narrow pass, that leads to the land northward, which goes along with a lot of the stuff in the Mintanah records and all these other, anyway, kind of cool stuff. And my narrow neck, like I say, people can have criticism of my narrow neck, because the narrow neck in my model, but in all the models, the narrow neck is confusing. But in my model, it definitely is confusing. I get that. As far as the most clear reading, because I'm taking and making the narrow passes completely separate from the narrow neck, right? Which I think I have reason to do, but I will accept people's criticism of that, because it's like, even I believe that Mormon and Moroni's picture of the land southward was different. Like, they pictured something a little different in their head than what we actually see on Google Earth. And that's why there's a little bit of confusion, even though all their directions are exactly right and all their seas are exactly right. They just kind of didn't understand the way shorelines went perfectly, which is normal for ancient geographers, right? It's just before Google Earth, people didn't understand shorelines quite well. They understood directions really well, though, right? They knew the sun rose in the east, they knew the sun in the west. They put all their directions off of that. So anyway, but check this out. So in mine, it's like they sit at Mulek, and there is this total narrow pass, right? And there's this whole, it's called the Huastec lands, right? Well, El Tijen is. So this huge, bountiful northern Veracruz lowland, very rich corridor with some amazing archaeological sites, absolutely amazing sites. And there's all of these fortified cities, like really like castles along this narrow pass here. Because if you can get around that narrow pass and flank it and get into that Huastec land, like, look how close you are to all the land of Bountiful and Zarahemla. Like, you could totally flank them. As long as you can keep them down in the lowlands and keep that pass, that very strategic pass, they can't get around on every side and flank you, right? Like, you can still have a line that's created by the geography, even if they've taken this lower area, which is why that was the border even before Moroni kicked them out and made the kind of the new, more southern border here. That is an important pass. And so if you look, I'm going to try and open Google Earth. Let me just show you this pass on Google Earth. Hopefully it doesn't kill the video feed. It probably will. So if it gets glitchy right here, bear with me. Okay, so this is this pass that I was just showing you, right? And you've got the Mexican highland here. This is all way up at 6, 7, 8,000 feet. You've got this really mountainous area, and all of these, like the El Viejon, these are like fortresses, essentially, these little sites here. They're all built on hills, basically in fortified locations. Let's see if I can find an actual picture of it that I can show you. Anyway, these sites are absolutely like lookout sites, absolutely just little fortresses. And not only that, there is like truly a narrow pass. Like, look at this tiny little narrow pass there and there, right? And so if, of course, you're going to sit a city, and like I say, I think that this probably is one of those cities, Mulek, that's protecting them from entering the land of Bountiful. Like, he's like, secure that narrow pass, right? Because if they are able to get around this narrow pass where we've had Mulek, once they get around it, it's only like 20 miles long. Then here you've got this huge plain where El Tihin and these Huastec lands are. If they are able to get around that pass, then they can take this entire land and then harass us on every side. So he's like, make sure you secure that narrow pass. I mean, do you see how well that works? And once again, read these actual verses. That works so well. Exactly what it's talking about. Whereas every other model, you try and like make it at work, it just kind of doesn't work very well, right? But it works beautifully in this model. It's spectacular. And there's narrow passes on both sides, right? Even on the west side, we'll see the same thing. You've got this narrow strip, this narrow coastal plain going all the way up West Mexico that it talks about over and over, right? Because you've got in the Book of Mormon, it talks about narrow passes on the east and on the west, right? And it says that the one between the line of Bountiful and the land of the land of Bountiful and Desolation is like a day and a half's journey, right? Wide. And so which is like probably about 30 miles. And that's exactly what you find over by Culiacan and Mazatlan. Like you've got this amazing coastal plain. It really is like this bountiful plain. It immediately just turns desolate as soon as you hit the narrow neck, which is Baja California, right? And that coastal plain in and of itself is a narrow neck too. So like I've said in other areas, that is my narrow neck. The narrow neck is, I'll just show you really quick. The narrow neck is Baja, right? Culiacan in that area is the area right between the land of Bountiful and the land of Desolation. Everything turns desolate north of there. I mean, this is the best desolation possibility that there is. It goes along with what Joseph Smith said. He said desolation stretched all the way from the Great Plains to the Four Corners. There's quotes in both my video and my article on Joseph Smith's quotes that go over those. It absolutely is desolate. It is where they build houses out of cement because there's no trees. It is where there is cannibalism, like archaeological evidence of cannibalism, just like the Book of Mormon says. There's all of these, there's so much stuff as far as the archaeology. It matches absolutely with what the Mintanah records say. It matches with the global idea that most Native Americans are promoting, like Chief Mitigaw and these guys who are talking about their own records and how they know it was like the entire continent. Anyway, just a lot of really cool stuff. Hope you check it out. Okay, so I think we're going to kind of end with these points that I've just covered. And I just hope that as you kind of go through this, you'll realize I'm just going to abbreviate, go over really quick the points that we hit that are so important. Okay, so the first one being Alma 22. Very clearly there where it shows things going from the east coast to the west coast. The land of Zarahemla, the narrow strip of wilderness, the land of Nephi, all of them talked about East Sea to the West Sea. Like, that's incredibly important. Okay, after that, we talked about the new border that Moroni builds, how important that is, how there's a string of cities and names those cities in those war chapters. Then one goes from the city by the sea on the west coast all the way to Manti, and then from Manti is in proximity to Nephiha. The Nephiha was built between Aaron and Moroni. That Moroni was on the east coast, that the entire string of cities going up to Mulek, right, which helped them not get around, to flank them and be surrounding them on every side, right, and that those get taken, and then there are war chapters that talk about them. So, and also we talked a lot about the Riverside and how it probably formed a border and how it likely runs from east to west. Anyway, such important points. I hope that you kind of think about these. Hopefully this has been informative to you. And some of the future videos we'll do, we will start going off on some of the other interesting things. One of the really important ones that I want to hit for sure is this right here. I want to talk about all the journeys, right? Because after what we've already talked, the next most important thing when it comes to geography is going through every single one of these Book of Mormon travel routes and journeys, right? And there's at least 11 of them. And so I map them out right here, and we'll do a video where we go through every single one of them. One of the most important ones has to do with that proximity between Ammonihah, Melech, right, where the people of Jershon go afterwards, right, and where I put it, I completely disagree with everybody else, where they think that Ammonihah and Melech is, because Ammonihah is close enough to Aaron, because we got Alma traveling between Aaron and Ammonihah. I think that my model is the only one that works well with this one, because remember, after the army hits Ammonihah, they come back with prisoners, and where do they get intercepted? At the Riverside. And that does not work with any of the other models. We're going to talk about that. It works great with my model. There's so many problems that are in other models that really just get taken care of in this model. Really, the only issue that I think in most people's mind has to do with the narrow neck, and you have to watch my video on the narrow neck so I can help you understand my reasoning. Because even for a long time that troubled me until I realized, oh, that's like nothing actually happens on the narrow neck. It's always by the narrow neck. Everything's happening by the narrow neck, and there's no indication that the narrow passes are actually on the narrow neck. That's two different things. Interesting. But I'll present my case to you, and you can kind of make your judgments on that. And then we'll also talk about the flight and distances, right, and how bonkers it is that everyone thinks that there couldn't be big distances in the Book of Mormon, like when the saints traveled like 2,500 miles to escape just persecution, right? When they went from New York to Ohio to Nauvoo to out west, they're going like almost 3,000 miles, 2,500 miles with hundreds of thousands of other people on the Oregon Trail, just to find a better life. And yet for some reason, people think that like the Nephites couldn't run away 3,000 miles when they are faced with genocide, like absolute annihilation, right? Their kids and wives have to end up being annihilated. You think that they would just go 200 miles and then be like, all right, wife, kids, take a sword. We're about to face our death. Like that's bonkers. Like heck no. Like I don't know how to make a strong enough case. I will in another video on how bonkers that is. It's like I guarantee you, these were good people. They weren't insane. They went as far as humanly possible until they were trapped by something that they could absolutely not go any further. And what is that thing that trapped them? Probably the freezing Great Lakes that were probably starting to freeze over, and the EC. Like they hit New York and they were trapped, and they had to make a last stand. If they could have gone another 5,000 miles, they would have. They couldn't. They were trapped by a winter that would kill them, right? And lakes and barriers that they couldn't really get across anymore, and an army. And to think that like they just went up into Veracruz, like they went 100 miles, and they're like, we can't go any further. Let's make our last stand. Okay, wife, take. It's bonkers, so crazy. Anyway, I'm done with my soapbox. Thanks a ton for watching this video. If you've made it through the whole thing, you deserve a ribbon. You're part of the Geography Nerd Club. I hope you join me in some of my other videos. Go ahead and leave a comment if you have any disagreements, or if I've misspoken somewhere or anything like that, or you want just a conversation. Go ahead and leave in the comments. I'll be happy to have a conversation down there. And I'm really glad that you made it to my channel here. And let's talk in another video soon. All right, so long.